So this video is called Irksomeness of Einstein's Special Relativity. And this is my information source. It's Harry Richer. He's from a dissident science group called the John Chappell Natural Philosophy Society. He's looked at mainstream physics and decided it is wrong, and then became a dissident. Right, according to Harry, special relativity is irksome, and he means by irksome it's troublesome. I think he calls it irksome because of what I call moving goalposts. So I've done a lot of videos explaining how the goalposts get moved in special relativity, and I think Harry's way of talking about that is to call special relativity irksome. The claims of special relativity keep changing, as I pointed out in some of my videos, and so I'm referring to one of my videos where I'm pointing out one of the goalposts being moved as regards acceleration. So according to Harry, Einstein developed a strategy whereby he attempted to avoid the irksomeness in two distinct ways. The first was vague and ambiguous truth claims coupled with equally vague and ambiguous analytical concepts and mathematical procedures. And the second was a constant revision of the foundation principles and truth claim interpretations in order to suppress the irksomeness of his theory. So basically Einstein is being vague in what he's saying, and then Einstein's also then changing his mind. So Harry's pointing out there's a lot of revision going on in relativity, which I call moving goalposts. And so then Harry carries on. The primary thesis of this analysis is that the special theory of relativity is nothing but the ether theory of Lamore and Lorentz, which has been mathematically altered to give the appearance that it is a different theory from that of the ether theory by the pretended use of postulates, which appears to give the special theory a different physical basis. The attempt to do this is basically a failure because the foundation of the theory contains irksome elements. And I'm making note here that ether can be spelt two different ways. And as I pointed out in my video entitled Ether in Einstein's 1905 Special Relativity paper, there is a confusing mess that Einstein made with the ether in his 1905 Special Relativity paper. So Harry carries on to say the fundamental principles or hypothesis, these which Einstein deceptively called postulates, have traditionally been a major cause of irksomeness. Einstein states that although they are apparently contradictory hypotheses, that they are in fact not contradictory. This is essentially his first and most important fundamental truth claim. It is that the two postulates are true principles of nature and that they are not contradictory. Here we have a major source of the irksomeness. It needs to be proved once and for all that these fundamental principles are not contradictory. No such proof has been produced, and the persistent irksomeness of the theory manifests in contradictory interpretations and changing statements of truth claims, and the irrational nature of the purported experimental verifications all demonstrate that there has not been a satisfactory reconciliation of the two fundamental postulates of relativity. So Einstein is claiming his two postulates are joined together, and Harry's pointing out that has not been proved. And so I say yes, if you look in Einstein's 1905 paper, he offers no proof as to how the two postulates can be combined. Mainstream relativity supporters seem to totally ignore this issue and seem to act from the assumption that the two postulates do combine without saying how. So that is one of the fundamental sources of the irksomeness. Harry complains that there has been revisionism going on, so that there are different versions of special relativity that get muddled up. Harry says the author's thesis, which is himself, is that the reason causing the irksomeness of Einstein's special theory of relativity is that it's an ether theory. Einstein's theory is essentially the ether theory of Maxwell, Lamore, Lorentz Ives. So that means that under one of the revisionisms, that is one of the versions of special relativity, namely that special relativity should really be an ether theory. He continues, its irksomeness arises when it asserts it is not an ether theory, because it pretends that it is a relative space-time theory following Minkowski's conception of space-time. This fundamental confusion is based on the two fundamental postulates, one taken from ether theory and the other from relativity, which Einstein attempts to make consistent with each other. The attempt was a failure, as evidenced by the characteristic irksomeness which pervades the theory at every turn. So irksomeness comes from the theory dealing with ether. He carries on, one particular irksome and very persistent error made by Einstein in his 1905 paper pertains to the irksomeness. In this paper, Einstein mistakenly stated that a clock on the equator will run slow relative to a clock at one of the poles. This claim was made as a contradiction of truth claim clarification by example of what the time dilation truth claim meant. However, this claim was false because the famous prediction was a mistake. And I've done a video on this issue. The goalpost removed once again, and I pointed out this in my video entitled Special Relativity, Moving Goalposts, the Clock Hypothesis. So what Einstein says in 1905 about clocks ends up having its goalposts moved. The irksome conclusion about the experimental verification of relativity is that the experiments viewed as a whole conform to a verification of the ether theory more closely than they conform to a verification of a relativity theory. So Einstein has confused things with the ether. This is an extremely irksome fact. One would have hoped that the experimental evidence had not been fudged to support the truth claims of relativity, so that the evidence could have been judged in an objective manner, so that the actual situation would be easier to resolve, rather than remain in the current confusion state. So he's pointing out the experiments are confused in what they're saying. The irksomeness is exacerbated by the fact that Einstein's special relativity is really a modified ether theory, and the difference between the two theories is theoretically ambiguous. So the ether is making Einstein's relativity ambiguous. Harry goes on to then say, I have tried to make the point that the theory of relativity is simply just an ether theory that pretends it is not an ether theory, but is instead a theory of relativity. So he's pointing out that Einstein's relativity is pretending to be a relativity theory when really it's got hidden away there, an ether theory. A primary claim of Einstein's theory is that there is no ether, but all the experiments come up validating ether theory, not relativity theory, because Einstein didn't really understand how to demonstrate the difference experimentally in his papers. It seems that he created a point of confusion regarding how to validate the difference between ether theory and his special relativity, and his time dilation mistake in his 1905 paper. Today, relativists fudged relative theory to make it seem that their claims were actually validated by the experiments, which instead validate the ether theory, because it has never been made clear how to differentiate between the two theories experimentally. Hence, physicists don't really understand how the two theories are different from each other. The factual evidence is all mixed up, and scientists have perpetuated a mistake, mainly because they really don't understand the meaning of the experimental evidence. They simply say that it proves relativity when the facts are clearly irksome. So the whole thing is really a confusing mess over this issue of ether. Harry concludes special relativity is false because it is irksome. He says, this leads us to the conclusion that relativity, i.e. Einstein's special relativity, must be false, since there are just too many examples of irksomeness that pervade the theory, from its theoretical underpinning to its claimed experimental validation. Everywhere you look in relativity, Einstein's special relativity, you will find an example of irksomeness. So the theory just doesn't fit the facts well and must therefore be discarded as false. So that is his conclusion from Einstein's relativity being in such a mess with its dealing of the ether. He thinks it should be discarded as false. Finish, thank you, at the end of this one.